It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Vero nihil verius. Nothing truer than truth. That's the family motto of a man named Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. And today, on this pilot episode of Don't Quill the Messenger, we're going to give you a little Oxford 101 as we explore the truth about the Shakespeare authorship mystery. On today's program, our guest is Bryan Wildenthal, the Vice President of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. Welcome, Bryan.
It's great to be here, Stephen.
We're so glad, Bryan, that we get to launch this series with you as our first guest, because you're going to talk about something very important to audience members getting to learn about this broadcast and future episodes. And we're doing like a 101 today. Is that about right?
Yeah. And this is the kind of question you run into. I was just sitting next to a lady on the train. She saw I was reading about Shakespeare, and people always want to know, what is the story with Shakespeare? And then I mentioned that I'm really interested. I've loved Shakespeare since I was a kid. I've become kind of a enthusiast for the Shakespeare Authorship Question. I mean, I'm a lawyer and a law professor by training, but I have this love of Shakespeare and this fascination with the Shakespeare Authorship Question. People then always want to know, what is the authorship question? Why do people wonder about who the author is? And then I say, I think there's a lot of evidence that Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, was the true author. And they're like, well, who's he? Why do you think that? And it just opens up all these basic questions. So I think, for this podcast, I think we kind of want to just sort of explore what is the authorship question and why do people have doubts about it?
On average, when you meet someone new who you haven't talked about this subject with before, and you ask them about their level of awareness of a Shakespeare authorship question, what do you find? Do you find that most people have at least heard about the idea?
Most people have heard about it, at least. Yeah, most people say, isn't there some question, or people have talked about for years or even centuries that there was some issue about who really wrote Shakespeare? Was there a group of people? Was there really more than one person behind the authorship of these plays and poems? Or was it some aristocrat or someone else? Was it Christopher Marlowe? Was it Edward de Vere? There are various candidates who have been proposed over the years. Sir Francis Bacon, of course, was one candidate that back in the 1800s, there was almost a craze about the Baconian theory. But a lot of people aren't
wait a minute. Aware. The Baconian theory, is that the theory that bacon makes everything else taste better?
Yeah, that's one of those guys. Sir Francis Bacon, he was a contemporary of Queen Elizabeth, and there was this theory in the 19th century. But a lot of people are not aware that since 1920, by far the most powerful and well-documented alternative authorship candidate has been Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford. So I do usually, when I talk to people on the train or whatever about this issue, I do kind of come around to that, and I do try to introduce them to why we would doubt the traditional theory of authorship, that there was this guy, William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon. I mean, that's the conventional orthodox view.
We all know that guy.
We've all heard of this guy. We've all
Some
heard
people
of
have
Stratford.
Pictures of him in their house. They don't even know why.
Yeah, no one really knows for sure what he looked like. There's a few pictures, and they all look kind of different, and none of them are really documented as being authentic. And the picture in the first folio, his head looks kind of like a misshapen light bulb.
So what you're telling us is that Shakespeare wasn't bald? Is that the truth we're really getting to here today?
I think the pictures they have of Edward de Vere, he did at least have hair.
I believe you're right.
So I don't know. But yes, I mean, what is this authorship question? Really, it is a debate or controversy about who the author Shakespeare really was. I mean, so we have these incredible works, this body of literary work, poems like the sonnets, Venus and Adonis, not as widely read today maybe, but it's considered one of the great erotic poems of all time. Plays like Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, Midsummer
Okay, now
Night's
you're talking about
Dream.
things that I think most people are familiar with and connected to, or were required to read in school or study at some point in their
I
lives.
hope so. Not as much now as it used to be, but yeah.
That's very true.
Certainly
But
hope
when
so.
you mention a poem like Venus and Adonis, which I think for a lot of people, maybe they're going, "Oh, I knew Shakespeare. Is that another one of Shakespeare's plays? What is that?" And but
Mhm.
I think it's important to point out that it's one of the earliest works attributed to a writer known as Shakespeare.
It was the first one to be published under that name. Yeah.
And I think the reason that it's important for people to be aware of that piece is because I think that there are so many allusions in that particular work that connect to the life of the author. And when you think about writers who write that first published piece, especially if it's poetry, how autobiographical it has to be or must be. And the tour de force works of most of the great writers are their lives coming out, right? They're very connected to the writer and what the writer has done. I mean, Steinbeck wouldn't be Steinbeck without the life that he personally lived.
Right.
Twain wouldn't be Twain.
Mhm.
Who's another one that I think is a really good example of a writer who, look at Dickens and how much of his personal life is in. Even Tolkien is hugely autobiographical when you look at his history with the war.
Exactly. Yeah, I've read about that. The Middle Earth, it's based a lot on the World War I and the experiences of the horrors of World War I. That's what informs that horrific battle with the orcs. But back to Shakespeare. So Venus and Adonis is a fascinating work. So it's the first publication under the Shakespeare name. It's a lengthy erotic narrative poem, and it's a highly polished masterwork. So yet we're told this is the first thing that Shakespeare published. When he published it, he didn't put his name on the author page, just underneath the dedication, and he refers to it in the dedication as the first heir of my invention, which raises the whole question whether William Shakespeare was an invented pseudonym that he was using. The other funny thing is, so we have this incredible body of works. We also have a lot of plays published anonymously. Before Venus and Adonis is published, there were a number of Shakespeare plays that were published, but not under anyone's name. They're published anonymously. And then even for years after Venus and Adonis, a lot of plays continue to be published anonymously. And so if the true author was William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, so the conventional view, as we're told, every teacher and professor tries to sell you on this idea that this businessman and actor from Stratford-upon-Avon, William Shakespeare, which Stratford is a town west of London, he had a name similar to the published name William Shakespeare.
How did he spell it?
Not identical. Well, it's spelled in a lot of different ways.
Wait a minute. How can it be spelled a lot of different ways?
Spelling was very imprecise in those days. They were really loosey-goosey about spelling.
Have you ever misspelled your own name?
Oh, no, never. I'm obsessive about that. But I'll tell you, the published name of the author is very consistently spelled, almost always spelled William Shakespeare the way we spell it today. But this guy from Stratford, businessman and actor from Stratford, he generally spelled it different ways, did not very often use the spelling that's on the published works, which raises an interesting question. So there are a lot of issues about that. But this conventional view that Shakespeare of Stratford is the author, it's often called the Stratfordian theory. So those of us who doubt that, who question that, we often are called anti-Stratfordians, to contrast with this conventional Stratfordian view. And many of us, many anti-Stratfordians, not all, believe that the true author was most likely Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford. We often refer to him simply as Oxford after his title. And we call ourselves Oxfordians. So that's the alternative theory of authorship that we're going to kind of explore today.
I think it's important. So we touched in, and I made a little joke there about the Baconians and the people who believed it was bacon. And I suppose you would call Marlovians those who say Christopher Marlowe. Obviously Stratfordian is the classical myth. And then there's us, Oxfordians, members of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. And I think that one of the things that the Stratfordians do, and you mentioned this, is they try to refer to anyone who doesn't believe in the Stratford story as an anti-something.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't like the term anti-Stratfordian. I am not an anti-Stratfordian. I am an Oxfordian.
Right, exactly. Well, that's the way most of us think of it. Yeah, we think of ourselves as Oxfordians, but you got to find a label somewhere. So there is a large camp of people who do doubt the Stratfordian theory. Like some of my good friends are Marlovians. They think Christopher Marlowe was the author. There are a lot of interesting things to say about Marlowe, but the fact is there's far more evidence, far more detailed evidence in favor of Oxford. There's far more evidence connecting Oxford to the works of Shakespeare than anything connecting this guy, this businessman, William Shakespeare of Stratford. That's one of the fascinating things. So the first reason why people might doubt this whole issue is that there's an incredible mismatch between William Shakespeare of Stratford and these incredible literary works that we've been talking about. And yet when you look at Oxford, there's an incredibly powerful match. You think of this like if the works of Shakespeare are like the glass slipper in the legend of Cinderella. You know, Cinderella, she tried on the glass slipper. And so the question is, who fits? Does the shoe fit? Who fits the glass slipper of these works? And when it comes to Oxford, the shoe fits in a multitude of different ways. It's almost uncanny how many parallels and connections there are between his life.
I absolutely love this metaphor because I think it's also important, the Cinderella story, before the shoe fits her, it is tried on every other woman in the land. And a lot of people will say, well, oh, yes, the Shakespeare Oxford authorship mystery. They say 60 different people could have done it. And none of that is right. It's really this guy from Stratford.
They like to make fun of saying, oh, yeah, there's like 50, 60 different candidates, implying that none of them could be serious because how could there be 60 different people? But the fact is, you're right. We've tried on this slipper many different ways. The Baconians,
I think it's important to try the slipper on all possible candidates to get to the truth. Isn't that the whole key point?
It's the scientific method. I mean, both my parents are natural scientists, and they would say, follow the evidence, follow logic, and experiment. Try things out. If one theory doesn't work, you experiment with a different theory. You explore the facts.
Okay, here's another part of that very important story that I think is interesting, and that is that the original story, the original Cinderella, not the Disney-fied version, but the original fairy tale, the stepsisters do everything they can to try to fit into that slipper, including one of them cuts off her own toes in order to fit into that slipper. And I think that if you take the metaphor further, that's exactly what the Stratfordians have tried to do, is they're trying to cut off their toes to make it fit into this slipper, and it just doesn't fit.
They've got a real problem. And there is this strange phenomenon. When you read the works of Shakespeare, they're, of course, remarkable. All these plays and poems, they indicate a vast knowledge of Greek and Roman classics. Clearly, whoever wrote these plays knew Italian and French language, culture, the geography of Italy, many of the cultural forms of Italy. There's a knowledge of law, medicine, seafaring, aristocratic sports like falconry. There's all this knowledge and experience in the plays. None of it fits with this successful businessman from Stratford. And so ironically, you have some Shakespeare scholars who say, oh, Shakespeare really wasn't that knowledgeable. He didn't really know much Greek. He didn't really know much law. It's like they want to dumb down Shakespeare, like you said, cut off his toes and force him to fit this conventional theory. Oxfordians would say, look, let's just kind of step back and take as a starting point the remarkable content and perspectives of these work, open our minds and look around and see who might fit the glass slipper. Who is out there who might fit it? And so we'll talk a little about Oxford. We can talk about Shakespeare of Stratford. There's reasons. There's like you say, there's the anti-reasons, the reasons to doubt Shakespeare of Stratford. But we're not here to tear somebody down. He was an interesting figure. He played some role in this whole mystery. It's nothing against Stratford or against Shakespeare of Stratford. But let's talk about Oxford. Who was he? So he was a nobleman, an aristocrat. His father died when he was 12 years old. And so although he was born into great privilege and great wealth, he was forced to become a ward of the Queen, of Queen Elizabeth I. So this is the Elizabethan era of Queen Elizabeth, the queen who fought against the Spanish Armada and is thought to have produced the great flowering of the English Renaissance. So it was an exciting era in English history. She was the daughter of King Henry VIII, who infamously went through quite a few wives.
with a very infamous headless mother.
Yes, yes, poor Elizabeth. Talk about daddy issues. Her father beheaded her mother. She was disowned as illegitimate, but eventually she had the last laugh.
Nearly beheaded herself by her sister too.
Yeah, some real sibling rivalry issues.
So there's a lot of intrigue going on in the British court at the time that these plays are being written, and they're being written in the middle of the English Renaissance, the Elizabethan era, the golden era, the golden age, right?
Yeah, it was an incredibly exciting time. And so Oxford was this passionate, hot-headed, mercurial aristocrat, always embroiled in love affairs and escapades. He was scandalizing Elizabeth's royal court constantly. As I said, his father died when he was 12, and Henry VIII pioneered this system, which Elizabeth adopted. It was a way to basically confiscate a lot of the wealth of her lords and nobles. But if an aristocrat's father died before he was 21 years old, he was forced to go live with the queen, and she would charge these exorbitant fees, supposedly as compensation for supervising his upbringing. And if you read All's Well That Ends Well, this Shakespeare play, this is all about a young nobleman named Bertram. In the very beginning of the play, he tells his mother, "My father's died. I now must go off to the king, to the royal court, to be in ward, evermore in subjection," because he's going to get robbed blind. This was basically, it was a confiscatory taxation device so Elizabeth could appropriate some wealth. She always needed more money, of course, for the royal treasury.
Did she really raise him?
No, she delegated that. No, it was all about the money. It was all about the money.
Wait a minute, she's charging services that she isn't rendering.
Well, when you're the queen, you can do that. So what she did, she would parcel this out. She would distribute these wards for people who were in this situation to her leading supporters and nobles, or even just her leading advisors. So she delegated the upbringing of the Earl of Oxford, Edward, Earl of Oxford, to Sir William Cecil, who was a commoner at that point, but he was her top advisor. William Cecil, who later became Lord Burleigh, was Queen Elizabeth's most powerful minister.
Okay,
all the historians agree. He was the power behind the throne in Elizabethan England. He was the guardian from age 12. He was the guardian who brought up and supervised the education of Edward de Vere. By the way, also basically forced Edward de Vere to marry his daughter as well. There's a whole other story there.
There is, and there are a lot of parallels in the plays that with regard to those relationships as well. But one of the things I wanted to touch on in my early exploration of this mystery, and I don't mind putting it out there, I started believing, when I first got into this mystery, I went Marlowe. That's how it was introduced to me. It was introduced to me by a Marlovian.
Oh, yeah. And Marlowe's a fascinating figure. I can totally understand that.
And it didn't take me long into my continual reading and study to go, okay, this isn't correct.
There's just not that much evidence. Yeah. And of course, Marlowe died, it's believed, in 1593. A lot of questions about his death. It may have been, the circumstances almost certainly were faked. Whether he survived that year is doubtful. A lot of powerful people wanted to kill Marlowe.
No, I believe he got a dagger in the eye. I believe that really.
Yeah. The Marlovians want to believe that he survived. And again, some of our best scholars are Marlovians. They've done tremendous work, wonderful work. So I think I welcome their contributions to this authorship debate. But there is a lot more evidence.
Well, what I was driving at is, when I first was getting into this, one of the most difficult things for me, and I think that people who are intrigued by this and who are interested in this need a little bit extra study in this area, because it can be very confusing, and that is how all of these characters, all of these figures in this historical tale have so many darn names, right?
Right, I know.
So, is he's Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford? Is he Oxford? Is he de Vere?
I know.
Is he William Cecil, or is he Lord Burleigh?
Exactly.
I thought his name was Cecil. No, it's Burleigh. So that's something that I think that sometimes can be a little
It's confusing. My own mother-in-law, when I was telling her about the Oxfordian theory, she said, "Oh, so you think Oxford's the author?" But I thought you said Edward de Vere was the author. So this exact thing.
Right.
And she was like, oh, I'm talking about the same person. Why am I using two different names? Yeah. So for simplicity's sake, we usually refer to Oxford since that was his title, but his family name was de Vere.
Correct. And what I think a lot of people don't realize either is when you talk about 17th Earl of Oxford, we hear about a lot of earls, Earl of Westmoreland, Earl of Derby. Like, there's a lot of earldoms. But what a lot of people don't know is that the reason why he's 17th Earl of Oxford as opposed to 8th or 9th, as many of his contemporaries were, is because his title had existed since 1066 when William the Conqueror created the title.
It's one of the oldest earldoms in England, and formally speaking, the highest ranking earldom. So formally speaking, Oxford's father was the great Lord Chamberlain of England, and Oxford at age 12, when his dad died, Oxford inherited that role, which formally, it was a purely ceremonial thing, but he was technically the highest ranking earl in England. There were no dukes at that time. Elizabeth and her father, they had kind of killed off and gotten rid of all the dukes. Dukes outrank earls, but there weren't any dukes at that point in time. And so the Earl of Oxford was Elizabeth's highest ranking noble, although only an adolescent boy when he first moves into William Cecil's household. Now, there's a story, you mentioned Cecil and Burleigh. It is confusing, but there's an interesting story behind that. So Oxford's guardian, and eventually his father-in-law, talk about some in-law issues, is Sir William Cecil. So he was a knight. He was knighted and all that, but he was a commoner, very powerful, very brilliant guy who basically ran the government for Queen Elizabeth. Now, Cecil and Elizabeth cooked up a scheme which pretty much they forced Oxford to marry Cecil's eldest daughter.
Which he didn't want to do.
He didn't want to do because, again, in this rigid hierarchical
It'd be
class
like marrying your
structure.
sister. I don't want to marry my sister.
Well, that was part of it. They grew up together.
Right,
from
in the
age
same
12.
household from age 12, all the
And
way
who
through
knows?
adolescence and
She was
teenagers.
much younger, too. She was like 5 years younger than him. So she may have looked up to him as an older brother. Who knows? There's doubtless a huge psychological melodrama behind that. But she was a commoner. Her father was a commoner. And in the rigid hierarchical class structure, this was something that Edward, Earl of Oxford, would have viewed as a huge insult. However, the Queen has the power to fix that situation. Not long before the wedding, she elevated Sir William Cecil to become a baron. She created him a baron, so he becomes Lord Burleigh, Baron Burleigh. And that made it minimally respectable to force Edward to marry Anne, who's now the daughter of a baron. Still,
so Edward goes to the Queen and
resented
says, I refuse to accept this marriage because I am a lord, I am an earl, and she is a commoner, and you cannot force me to marry a commoner.
He
which
probably
was
never dared to
true,
say that.
right?
That this is a woman who's, remember, her father's cutting off people's heads. So I doubt if he even dared to say that, but it's clear there was probably
She
some
fixed
resentment.
the problem, though, didn't she?
She
was like,
fixed the
oh, really?
problem.
You are now Lord Burleigh.
Yeah.
Now what are you going to
And
say
by the
about
way,
it?
and so what we've just been describing, so here we have Edward marrying Anne, this young girl who's the daughter of his guardian. So his guardian becomes his father-in-law, a little bit incestuous there. And the Queen is part of this too. We have basically just described the plot of All's Well That Ends Well. Because again, in All's Well That Ends Well, Bertram is forced to marry Helena, who is a commoner, the daughter of the king's physician, his doctor. And Bertram, who's a real kind of an arrogant prick, he doesn't really like this at all. He's like, you're forcing me to marry this woman beneath my station, is one of the most unpleasant characters in all the Shakespeare plays, I think. But the king says, oh, shut up. I'm the king. And he says, it's within my power to raise up her station. And so I will ennoble her. And that resolves the issue. Bertram is still not very happy. That's exactly what Elizabeth did. She elevated Cecil to become Lord Burleigh. She forces this marriage, and then we get the second big melodrama. So the way I like to think of it is there were two great traumas of Edward de Vere's life. The first is that his father dies when he's 12 years old. He is...
Would you say he was maybe haunted by that the rest of his life?
I think absolutely, because soon after his father died...
I use that term on purpose.
His elder sister tried to disinherit him. His elder sister, who had a different mother, claimed that Edward, her younger brother, by a later wife, the elder sister claimed that second marriage was invalid. And so she's basically accusing her younger brother of being a bastard that would disinherit him from his earldom. He's like 13 years old when this is going on. You can imagine the psychological trauma. And then, of course, he's forced to become a ward to the Queen, his estate, all his wealth. is under the control now of Cecil and the Queen. They kind of start robbing him blind. He's forced to marry the daughter of his guardian.
The sister made that up in order to try to keep control of the estates.
She wanted the money. Yeah, she wanted the money. There was no other son, so he had these at least one older sister, and if she had succeeded in disinheriting him, she could have gotten a lot of the money. So it was a horribly cruel thing to do. He wrote a poem about it too, bewailing the loss of my good name. Because, of course, in those days, the imputation of illegitimacy was a horrendous scandal and a stain.
Oh, my goodness.
Aside from the fact that he's going to lose his earldom and lose all his wealth, which he's already losing a big chunk of it anyway, because, again, Queen Elizabeth's charging him extortionate fees for the privilege of being William Cecil's ward. Anyway, so that's the first great trauma of his life. Father dies. By the way, his mother remarries within a year, which was traditional and was the typical expected thing. But for a 12 or 13-year-old boy, the mother's remarriage might well have seemed to be unduly hasty. Of course, I've just described the plot of Hamlet.
While his father's death is haunting him through the whole thing, right?
Yes, the baked funeral meats are used. The baked funeral meats coldly furnish forth the marriage table for Hamlet's mother,
and it's a great line.
He's seething with Freudian resentment. This just sort of.
That scene in Hamlet between Hamlet and his mother is a roughly around 18-minute long scene. It's one of the longest scenes in the Shakespearean canon between just technically two characters. The father ghost does come through that scene, but technically those two characters, a very long scene, very emotionally driven scene. And it's one of the most beautiful scenes, I think, ever written in literature. I think it's one of the reasons why Hamlet stands apart from so many plays. And you could imagine how a young man at that impressionable age would feel at that time, and how writing it into this play and telling this story this way would be so liberating to him and his feelings. And the reason I mention that is because the next thing I want you to help explain to us is, okay, we've connected this guy's life to the incidents of the plays. Why does he write the plays?
Right, yeah. Well, I think, why do writers write? I mean, part of it, like you say, could be cathartic. He's got these demons that he wants to process and deal with. The death of his father, maybe a sense of betrayal of his mother remarries. The second big trauma of his life is his marriage to Anne, who is the daughter of his guardian, because she becomes pregnant with their first child after he's left for a year-long voyage to continental Europe. So Edward de Vere goes on a grand tour of Europe, as many wealthy noblemen did at that time. He was desperate to visit Italy, to explore the art and culture of France. Italy, visited Germany, possibly visited Greece and Sicily as well. He learns the news on this trip that his wife is pregnant. And apparently someone poisoned his mind or suggested the suspicion that maybe he wasn't the father. There may have been a question about the timing, because this was several months after he had departed that she learned she's pregnant. And so he basically accused her of infidelity, and he rejected paternity over his first daughter, Elizabeth. Anne's daughter is named Elizabeth, probably after the Queen. And he refused to reconcile with her for 5 years. He comes back from this trip to Europe, and William Cecil tries to force a quick reconciliation, but he's very suspicious. And so he basically publicly rejects her, and it's a huge scandal. 5 years later, they eventually reconcile. They have several more children, 2 more daughters, and several infants, I believe, who died in infancy, as was very common. And then Anne dies at quite a young age. She's only in her early 30s when she dies. And it seems like Edward de Vere may eventually have been tormented by guilt over the way he treated her, because they did reconcile. And of course, here we have the central psychodrama of 5 or 6 different Shakespearean plays.
There's a whole string of them
Othello,
right there.
Right. There's Othello's the one everyone knows about, the false accusation of
Winter's
Desdemona.
Tale is
Winter's
another
Tale.
Magnificent example.
Cymbeline, Measure for Measure, Much Ado About Nothing.
Yes.
Hero, she's a young fiancé. Her fiancé falsely accuses her of infidelity. So there's this huge theme of men raging and falsely and recklessly accusing the young wife, the fiancé, of infidelity, and then remorsefully recognizing, sometimes too late, that they were wrong. And then these incredibly emotional scenes of forgiveness and reconciliation. And so Oxford did reconcile with his wife. They went on to have more children.
And often those same characters are also reconciling with a daughter in the story as well.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of parallels between the psychodrama you see in the plays. Now, I should pause here and say a lot of people, they kind of ridicule Oxfordians. They'll say, "Oh, you're taking a too literal autobiographical view of the plays," and we're not at all. No one's claiming the works of Shakespeare are infused with tremendous amounts of imagination. Plus, a lot of them are derived from classical legends, histories, and stories. Shakespeare borrowed. Everyone agrees. Doubters,
source material
Orthodox
is something I
Stratfordians.
really would like to touch about, because I think one of the key things that you discover when you are getting into the research on this issue is an undeniable connection to some of the plays to certain sources. Many scholars across the world agree that the chief of those would be Ovid's Metamorphoses, which had just recently been translated into English from its original Greek.
Yeah, and what a coincidence. And
during Oxford's lifetime.
Yes, and not only that, it's like, what a coincidence. Yeah, you're right. The Stratfordian scholars, this is an accepted basic point about Shakespeare, that Ovid's Metamorphoses, in particular the Arthur Golding English translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses,
and who's that guy?
Is an incredibly important source for Shakespeare. Well, funny you should ask. And just by, I'm sure it's just an incredible coincidence, Arthur Golding is Edward de Vere's uncle. Okay, it's his mother's brother. He was living with the de Vere family at the time he was allegedly translating Ovid's Metamorphoses. He was probably tutoring Edward de Vere in Latin at the very time that he's translating Ovid's Metamorphoses from Latin into English. And in fact, there is a theory, and there's some interesting evidence that the young Edward, who was a precocious teenager at this time, might have helped him with the translation, maybe as an educational exercise, because the translation of Ovid that was published as by Arthur Golding is very racy and very erotic. Golding was this very straight-laced, puritanical kind of figure. None of his other translations have any of these erotic overtones. Of course, these Roman writers like Ovid, they were much more freewheeling than these British people in the 16th century. But a young, hot-headed teenager like Edward de Vere.
What does Horatio say? I am much more an ancient Roman than I am a Dane, right?
Yeah, yeah. But the funny is, that's just one of literally dozens of, quote-unquote coincidences. So the Orthodox Stratfordians would say, oh, that's all. You're just trying to be autobiographical. That's so silly. This is all just coincidences. Well, they have got a lot of coincidences to explain away. We haven't even scratched the surface yet. I mean, the basic, as I said, the biographical facts of Oxford's melodrama, with his father dying, with his early marriage, accusing his wife of infidelity, that matches some of the psychodrama in the plays. And again, we're not saying the plays are just, he's not just writing his autobiography, but any great artist is infused with the passions and demons they bring to their works. They can't get away from it. Writers, even without knowing it, without realizing it, are going to give voice to their innermost demons and obsessions. And you see that reflected so many times from Oxford's biography in the works of Shakespeare. It's in the Venus and Adonis also there. So as a young nobleman, as like 20-something nobleman, it's recorded, it's historically recorded that there apparently was a flirtation between Oxford and Queen Elizabeth. She was a real power player. She liked to play off her nobles against each other.
Well, it's well known that she slept with a lot of the lords.
She was no
at court.
virgin queen. Yeah, she had an affair, it's believed, with Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. She may have consummated an affair, who knows, with Edward. Now, she was in her late 30s, 40. She was probably an attractive older woman. The most important thing, she was powerful. As anyone will tell you who reads history, power is an aphrodisiac, whether it's a male ruler or a female ruler. Look at Catherine of Great of Russia. She had her pick of all her hot young noblemen. And so Queen Elizabeth,
look where that could get you. I mean, if the whole goal in court becomes, and from what we can learn of Elizabethan history, and I think you have to remember to connect the two together always, because I believe that the court itself is so connected to the plays. And I want to touch on that aspect of it too in just a moment. But the whole goal of court at that time was the favor of the queen.
Mm-hmm.
And how could you get the utmost favor of the queen? Become her lover.
Mm-hmm. Or at least flatter her. And so these kind of flirtations clearly happen. Well, Venus and Adonis is about a kind of an older predatory seductress who's often referred to as the queen in the poem. And she's pursuing a naive youth who's kind of diffident, who doesn't really wants to focus on hunting and all this. And so one wonders if Oxford eventually publishing this poem under the name Shakespeare was kind of just playing upon and reminiscing about this youthful flirtation with the queen, a powerful woman who dominated his whole life. You look at the women in Oxford's life, I think that is really a key to it in many ways. His elder sister threatening to disinherit him, his young innocent wife Anne, whom he cruelly disowns and accuses of infidelity, later reconciles, the queen, who is this powerful female sovereign he's dealing with intimately his whole life. Often, I think one senses with great frustration, and he resents her. And yet the funny thing is, Queen Elizabeth was constantly forgiving Oxford. He would engage in these love affairs, these scandals. She threw him into the Tower of London one time for several months. He slept with her leading lady in waiting, had an affair. They produced an illegitimate son. She locked all three of them up in the tower for a while. But
so
then
he himself fathers a bastard, quote unquote.
He had a son out of wedlock who was named Edward Vere. And this was a huge scandal. He probably had other lovers, probably men as well as women. We don't know the half of it, I think, but we know for sure Anne Vavasor was this beautiful, striking, intelligent woman that we know he had an affair with. And she was one of the Queen's maids of honor. Queen Elizabeth locks him up, and yet just a few years later, the Queen is reconciled to Oxford. She obviously has a soft spot for him. She grants him an annuity of £1,000 a year. Now,
okay, let's get to that in a second, because we don't want to forget that, because I think that's one of the most big. We want to talk about mysteries.
It's a very intriguing fact,
because that's one of the great mysterious things about this guy and his relationship with the Queen. But I love how you pointed out, because people might say, oh, well, he's the 17th Earl of Oxford. But when I see a documentary about Elizabeth, I don't hear about him. I hear about Dudley. I hear about Leicester. P.S. Same guys. Right. You got to remember. It's one of those things again.
Yeah. Not two guys, one lover, Dudley.
Yes.
Leicester,
right. But that's important. People, which one? Wait, she was sleeping with which one? Well, both, and probably several others.
Probably several more.
Sure. But we do have documented evidence of some of the things that you just said, that the affair with Anne Vavasor and the illegitimate child, the throwing them all in the tower and then forgiving them, even though it was technically an executable offense. And I think when you look at Measure for Measure, that play touches on that moment in his life in ways that are so profound.
Oh, yeah.
And the forgiveness is given. The whole premise of that play is that Isabella is trying to save her brother, who's been locked up because he got caught having an affair and getting the wrong girl pregnant. So I think that we talk about the plays and the characters. One of the chief characters is the Queen. And many of the characters in the plays, I think scholars across the world agree, oh, he's talking about Elizabeth here. He's talking about Elizabeth here. He's talking about Elizabeth here. Some of those are Titania in Midsummer Night's Dream is a huge one.
Cleopatra
is a giant one.
Yeah. And he talks about Cecil too. So William Cecil Lord Burleigh, the Queen's top minister, that's Polonius in Hamlet. Even Orthodox Stratfordian scholars have long agreed it's hard to avoid the conclusion that Hamlet with Polonius is satirizing William Cecil. And how does he get away with this? How would a commoner from Stratford be depicting the Queen in these veiled ways as Cleopatra? How would he be satirizing the Queen's most powerful minister on the public stage? The only way you get away with that is if maybe you are a high-ranking nobleman on intimate terms with the Queen and she's willing to tolerate this, especially perhaps if he maintains a polite public fiction of publishing only under a pseudonym. So there's sort of plausible deniability for all concerned.
And not only how do you get away with it, but how do you even know how do you have access to court? How do you have access to the queen? How do you have direct interaction with her if you're a commoner from Stratford who sells grain and invests in theaters?
Yeah, that's one of the big mysteries. There are so many things about the plays that are a mismatch. The learning, the knowledge of the foreign languages, the culture and geography of Italy, the aristocratic perspectives. Almost all of the plays are set in royal courts or aristocratic households, almost all but one, I think. I think only Merry Wives of Windsor is sort of set in a non-aristocratic provincial town. That's the only one. And now, of course, a commoner could write about royal courts, but the whole perspective in the plays is deeply sympathetic to aristocratic points of view. Now, of course, a lot of people will criticize. So Oxfordians often get slammed and say, oh, you're just a bunch of snobs. You don't think a commoner could write the plays. That's nonsense. I mean, many Shakespeare authorship doubters totally embrace that people from middle-class backgrounds, from very impoverished backgrounds, could and did become great artists.
Ben Jonson wasn't a nobleman.
Yeah, and look at Marlowe. Talk about our friends, the Marlovians. Marlowe came from a significantly more impoverished, modest background than Shakespeare of Stratford. No one questions. He was a brilliant artist. Robert Burns, Walt Whitman. The point is, what kind of art do you produce and what are your perspectives? So Oxfordians would say, look, it's not snobbish. It's just realistic to face up to the fact that the works of Shakespeare are overwhelmingly aristocratic in their bias, their perspectives. Indeed, a lot of us are actually kind of uncomfortable with the degree to which there is kind of this arrogant, class-based presumption in the works of Shakespeare. Walt Whitman didn't even like the works of Shakespeare that much because Walt Whitman found them offensively elitist. However, Whitman also said, when you read these history plays, you got to think that the true author wasn't this Stratford guy. The true author, according to Walt Whitman, had to be one of those wolfish earls in the plays themselves. This was 30 years before anyone had come up with the Oxfordian theory. Whitman, with the brilliant insight of a true artist, is recognizing that this conventional Stratfordian myth just doesn't fit. The shoe doesn't fit. The glass slipper fits with a disgraced, hot-headed aristocrat with all his flaws, all his faults. We don't admire Oxford necessarily. He's a fascinating figure. It's hard to look away from him because he's such an intriguing, melodramatic figure. But he did a lot of horrible stuff. I mean, he was a caddish, arrogant guy. He hurt a lot of people, clearly. But great artists are not always the nicest people you'd want to babysit your kids. Great artists are often caddish, irresponsible people. Look at
overindulgent.
Yeah. I mean,
addictive personalities.
Right. I mean, but
emotional.
In the final analysis, though, what saves Shakespeare, I think what sort of salvages and redeems Shakespeare for most of us, is he finally does seem to arrive at this humanity, this insight. He has a great sympathy and a great empathy for humanity. And his characters go through these catharses and these resolutions where they do reconcile, they do forgive. And he brings characters to life, some of whom are commoners, etc. Any character Shakespeare deals with, he makes this a living, breathing, sympathetic person. Even one of his most notorious characters, Shylock, disturbing play, The Merchant of Venice, it's infused with anti-Semitism. This was a profoundly anti-Semitic era. And yet you read this play, and Shylock is a powerful, compelling, living, breathing character. It's like Shakespeare can't help himself but be empathetic with the human element of any character, even a villain.
Oh, I think that's also true in Othello. And I think, one of the brilliance of that play is that there is this twist on the take, right? What Shakespeare's doing there is saying, okay, Iago expects that because Othello is a Moor, that he is lesser and that he's going to be more prone to violence and more prone to rage, and that he's going to be able to manipulate him into his weaker inferior. And then he gives Othello the most beautiful language of anyone else in the play, and in some ways anyone else in the entire canon, the eloquence with which Othello speaks and the intelligence that he demonstrates. And he goes, he's just because he's black doesn't mean that he's not intelligent, that he's not smart. Any man, regardless of their intelligence or where they're from, if you pick at them like Iago does at Othello, is going to break. And when you connect that to the story of Oxford being told that his wife had cheated on him and had fathered this daughter from another man, it makes you wonder, who was Iago? Because clearly the author is Othello.
Yeah, some scholars say Roland York, who was a servant of Edward de Vere's, who traveled with him to Europe, and they had a close relationship, some suggestions even of a homoerotic relationship, but he may well have poisoned de Vere's mind to think that this infidelity happened. Yeah, so I think Othello's a great example. I mean, it's a daring play. I mean, here the author is depicting a black man defiantly marrying a white woman from a privileged background. That's the greatest taboo of the era. And Shakespeare, we're not saying he's politically correct. So there are other plays where Shakespeare, there is a racist element, and he uses black-skinned characters and depicts them in a way which definitely resonates with racist attitudes, just like The Merchant of Venice resonates with anti-Semitism. And yet he creates these vivid characters who rise above that as individual human beings. So I see Shakespeare as an artist in a deeply unjust society, this hierarchical, cruel, racist, anti-Semitic society, who has this incredible vision of humanity, and he actually sees beyond that. And he creates these characters that inspire us today, so that I think a lot of people go see Othello and they think, wow, what an incredible statement against racial hierarchy. Or they you see Shylock's speeches, if you prick us, do we not bleed?
Sure.
It's evoking the common humanity, even though you got to face up to the fact that this was a profoundly unjust society. And Shakespeare or Edward de Vere, they're part of that. And they're not angels, and they're not pure. They're not, immune from this stuff. Let me go back. There was one point we were talking about, like, why Edward de Vere, and we talked about the £1,000 a year annuity that Elizabeth.
Oh yes, that's what I wanted to get.
One way to build up to that is the other reason people say, well, why would you think Edward de Vere in the first place even possibly was the author? Well, here's an important thing to keep in mind. Edward de Vere, aside from being a hothead, scandal-prone, bad boy nobleman, he was widely hailed by his own contemporaries as one of the finest poets and playwrights of the era. So we have published statements during this time. Gabriel Harvey, 1578, Angel Day, 1586, William Webb, 1586. The book Art of English Poesy, an anonymously published book in 1589. This book praises Oxford as an excellent writer, said he was one of several courtiers and noblemen of literary bent, but this book indicated that Oxford's true artistic skills and those of these other noblemen could only be appreciated, quote, if their doings could be found out and made public with the rest. And this book says, of which number is first that noble gentleman Edward, Earl of Oxford. The same book says Oxford deserved the highest praise for comedy and interlude. Francis Mears, 1598, said Oxford was among the best for comedy in England. So, but here's the weird thing. So Oxford has this great reputation as a courtier poet, as someone who a lot of his contemporaries thought was a great artiste. And yet we have no body of works to connect up with him that would explain this.
Do we have any works at all? Do we have any
just a few early poems,
writings in other books, any publishing of any other works, or works dedicated to him as being an editor or a patron or anything like that?
There are a lot of works dedicated. So in addition to having a reputation as a fine poet and playwright himself, it is well documented that Oxford was a patron and a sponsor of other writers, musicians, and artists. And they raved about him. He got enormous praise for being a generous patron of the arts. And this, don't take it from us. Stephen May, who's an Orthodox Stratfordian scholar, he said Oxford was extremely generous, patronizing other writers, and actually took an interest in their work, read their works in rough draft. And so he was clearly someone involved with this. In fact, Stephen May even points out, to the extent Oxford is criticized as maybe squandering his fortune, one reason for that is because he's so generous, giving away a lot of his money to musicians and artists. But then the question is, did Oxford personally write poetry? We do have a number of early poems from the time he was in his teens and his 20s, a few of which circulated in manuscript. Some of them were published in his 20s in a book called The Paradise of Dainty Devices. But these poems, these are immature poems. They cannot account for the reputation that he has. We don't have a single play or comedy or interlude that's explicitly connected to Oxford. So why is everyone in Elizabeth's court, why are all these commentators saying he's the best for comedy in England? That's the big mystery. Oxford had this reputation. We seem to be missing a body of works. With the works of Shakespeare, we have this glass slipper. We have these incredible works with a reputed author who doesn't fit the shoe, and yet we have Oxford who does fit the shoe. So the theory is that Oxford was the author of the works of Shakespeare, hiding behind a pseudonym, and that people, literary people in court circles, knew this, and so they hailed him and recognized him as being a great writer, but it could not be explicitly stated publicly. Again, and this was a book published in 1589. It says you could only find out about the works of these courtiers or aristocratic writers, quote, if their doings could be found out and made public with the rest. A separate passage in that book says flat out, quote, many noble gentlemen in the court, meaning the royal court, have written commendably and suppressed it, unquote, or else, quote, suffered it to be published without their own names to it, as if it were a discredit for a gentleman to seem learned and to show himself amorous of any good art. So this is documenting the fact that there was kind of a stigma of print. There was a bit of a scandalous association. Noblemen were not supposed to pursue any profession to make money.
But it
Certainly
also
not a
tells
writing
me
profession.
that they're writing, and that what that passage tells me is that the plays exist. They've been shown at court.
They've been seen,
and
yes.
people have seen them.
Oh,
They've
yes.
talked about them because they were written for the court to view first, before the public. And this is a writer saying, if we could only get our hands on some of those plays.
Right, yeah. Or just saying, kind of coyly saying, you know, if only all this could be publicized, then you could see what great work they're doing. So it is, and Orthodox scholars themselves, again, there's a remarkable convergence. A lot of Orthodox Shakespearean scholarship strongly supports the Oxfordian theory. They just don't want to admit it. So the new trend is
these plays suddenly do become publicized, and they suddenly do become performed publicly
later.
And,
Later.
And in a lot of those later works is when we start to see some of the more developed, maybe not for the best, but the history plays as they are. And you talked about this £1,000 a year payment that this guy is receiving. And coincidentally, while this guy's receiving all this payment, all of these plays, which are so pro-crown.
Yeah, the patriotic history plays. Henry V, Fight the French, you know, the Battle of Agincourt. So yeah, it does seem like the author Shakespeare, whoever that was, is churning out these exciting, stirring historical dramas, by the way, which take a certain position in the Wars of the Roses and are flattering to Queen Elizabeth and other things which also fit with Oxford and his whole family background. But yeah, he's publishing these plays, and at the same time, Queen Elizabeth, for reasons which are never stated on the public record, and this is one of the most miserly, penny-pinching queens in world history. She did not lightly part with money. And Oxford, in fact, was always begging her for money and preferment and advances. But she chose to keep him on kind of a short leash. She gave him £1,000 a year annuity. He was not to be held accountable for it, but it was a regular stipend. She apparently didn't want to trust him with a monopoly or giving him some lucrative office that he could exploit for himself. She wanted to dole out the money directly. We don't know exactly what this was for, but it is very interesting that she chose to do this. And it starts in 1586, which coincides and continues. And King James continued the stipend for 1 year after Elizabeth died. Oxford himself died just 1 year after Queen Elizabeth did. So for the last 17 years of his life, 1586 to 1604, 18 years, I guess, he's getting £1,000 a year. And this is the golden age during which the works of Shakespeare finally do get published. Now, we mentioned right at the beginning, we started out with Venus and Adonis. So Venus and Adonis, published in 1593. Oxford is 43 years old. which is pretty old for those days. That was considered quite mature back
Thanks,
then.
Bryan. Thanks a lot.
I know. Well, tell me about it. I'm over 50, but so this is, he's 43. And by the way, the sonnets are also written around this time. It's another funny thing. So how do you fit the sonnets with the traditional Stratfordian theory? The sonnets refer to the author. The author of the sonnet says, "Oh, I've seen 40 winters when your brow has been besieged by 40 winters, beaten and chopped with tanned antiquity. I'm lame, I'm disgraced." None of that really fits with a 29-year-old up-and-coming successful actor and businessman from Stratford who it just doesn't fit. Oxford is exactly the right age. He's 43, and he's probably, they say your mileage may vary. Let's just say Oxford at age 43 has been a hard partier and a hard liver for many years. He's been living large and partying hard for many years. He probably looked a little bit older than a typical 43-year-old today.
Well, he's the rock star Earl of his time, right? Like in that sense, he's got that. He has that oldest title. He was a very good-looking man.
Mm-hmm.
He
was the Italianate Englishman. He was ridiculed and mocked, also admired for being the most Italian of the English aristocrats because he had spent this year in Italy. His Wanderjahr as a young man was spending more than a year in continental Europe and bringing back Italian fashions and culture and style.
Okay, so one of the questions I asked you earlier was why did Oxford write the plays? And now we've touched on a couple of different things. One, to kind of go through some of his own personal experiences. Two, to please the Queen.
Mm-hmm.
Three, as it looks to raise the nation, because it is some of the greatest patriotic propaganda, nationalistic propaganda ever written.
Yeah, I think in a lot of reasons. I think great writers don't necessarily need a reason to write. They're driven to write. Usually they just have stories. They have a story to tell that just pours out of them. So I think most great writers look for an outlet to write. And the question then is, what do they infuse into that? What do they bring into that? So when we look at the works of Shakespeare, this was clearly a brilliant, tortured person who's pouring out these poems and plays. And we just need to really carefully look at the cultural influences, the knowledge and learning that goes into them, and the psychodramas that seem to be driving this author. And if you really look at that, you're led to Edward de Vere. Let's just give a few more examples again, because boy, if you talk about coincidences, there's a great book by Hank Whittemore, 100 Reasons Why Edward de Vere is Shakespeare. And
where can they find that book?
It's on Amazon. You look it up. Yeah, Hank Whittemore, Whittemore, 100 Reasons Why.
He'll be happy for the plug,
why
I'm
Shakespeare
sure.
is Edward de Vere. And literally, it's 100 different reasons. And if you think they're all coincidences, well, you really have to believe in some pretty remarkable coincidences. Like here's a few. Hamlet gets captured by pirates in the English Channel. Guess what? Totally coincidental. Edward de Vere, when he returns from his year in continental Europe, his ship is captured by pirates. He's stripped naked. All his belongings are stolen. He would have been murdered, except somebody recognized him as an earl. And so they kind of realized, oops, they got a hot potato here. He was set ashore, naked and bereft of his possessions in England. And that's exactly the incident. And this incident of the pirates.
You can't make this stuff up.
You can't. And it wasn't in the sources. He didn't. And it's none of the sources. So Hamlet is not an original story. There's a lot of historical sources for Hamlet. I'm not saying Hamlet's not just autobiographical.
But that's an interesting addition to the play.
It's a weird addition because it almost doesn't fit. And that's totally original to Shakespeare, the thing with the pirates. And guess what had happened to de Vere? Look at the rape of Lucrece. So after Venus and Adonis, the second great narrative poem published under the name William Shakespeare is The Rape of Lucrece. It's not widely read today. It's an incredibly powerful depiction of sexual assault from the perspective of a woman. So again, just as Shakespeare, he can put himself in the shoes of a Jewish character in Merchant of Venice, of a black character in Othello. He often breaks the gender barrier. He's very empathetic with his female characters. He plays with gender boundaries. In The Rape of Lucrece, he's depicting a horrific sexual assault from the perspective of Lucrece. Now, the story is based on a Roman legend with historical roots. But the strange thing is, in this poem, the narrator, Lucrece, goes off on a long digression for dozens and dozens of lines describing in great detail a painting of the Battle of Troy. Now, this description has been matched up with an actual painting in the Palazzo Ducale in Mantua, Italy. And it's a painting in the Sala di Troia, one of the rooms in this palace. And if you observe the painting, you can track the description in remarkable detail. This is the painting the author Shakespeare is describing in The Rape of Lucrece. Now, Shakespeare of Stratford never left England, that anyone knows. We know that Edward de Vere traveled through northern Italy, very likely visited Mantua. We know he gained access to aristocratic palaces. We have documentary evidence that he applied for admission to the Doge's palace in Venice.
And
was
another
unanimously
giant source of a huge portion of the Shakespearean canon when you look at the plays that are all set in Italy or in Italian towns.
Right, 1/3 of the plays that Shakespeare wrote are set in Italy. Venice, obviously, being hugely important when you look at Merchant of Venice, Two Gentlemen of Verona, Romeo and Juliet. And so we know that Shakespeare gained access to private aristocratic homes in Italy no commoner would have. How coincidental that The Rape of Lucrece has this incredibly detailed description of a painting on the ceiling of a great room in a ducal palace in Mantua, Italy. You can't make that up. And then just thirdly, this is like a minor point, but it's the little details that are telling. So in The Taming of the Shrew, Kate, of course, who's her wealthy father in The Taming of the Shrew, is named Baptista Minola.
Mm-hmm.
We have documentary evidence that Oxford, while he was in Italy, borrowed 500 crowns from a wealthy man named Baptisto Negroni. At the same time, his father-in-law back in England, William Cecil, arranged for an Italian merchant in London named Benedetto Spinola to advance him another few £1,000s. Baptista, Baptisto, Minola, Spinola. Did he mash up the two names to come up with Kate's father? Sure, maybe it's a coincidence. But how funny, how funny
How
that
ironic.
in The Taming of the Shrew, her father's Baptista Minola, and then you have Baptisto Negroni and Benedetto Spinola. I mean, leave aside the fact that Shakespeare of Stratford never went to Italy, but that's, there's a whole book about this, the Richard Roe, the Shakespeare Guide
That's a great
to Italy. Wonderful book. And we should not forget to mention the new documentary film by Cheryl Egan Donovan. The title is Nothing is Truer Than Truth. And this is a very rigorous documentary. And Cheryl Egan Donovan explores the year that Oxford spent in Italy and France, his Wanderjahr, exploring Europe and absorbing all this culture. And she ties it together, interviewing many experts and scholars. She ties it together, like you said, to so many of the works of Shakespeare. Why is only one Shakespeare play set in Elizabethan England? More than 1/3 of them are set in Italy. Could that be connected to the fact that the formative experience of Edward de Vere's young adulthood was the year he spent in Italy and other countries in continental Europe?
Well, I think it's absolutely true, not only in the fact that the plays are set in Italy, but also the type of artistic style the plays reflect as well in the character development, in the telling of the story, in the way that his art changes from having experienced theater in Italy, I think is something from an artist perspective you can't deny. You go, okay, well, this guy went and did a tour of Italy for a while, not only as an aristocrat, but also as an artist. And when he came back, he brought back that Renaissance Italy culture with him, and it reflected in his work and how his work changed, especially with characters in that particular play. As you mentioned, Taming of the Shrew, which can be very connected to stock commedia dell'arte characters that he could have witnessed firsthand at that time in Italy.
Yeah, Taming of a Shrew is a rich source. In fact, and there's the earlier version of Taming of the Shrew called The Taming of a Shrew, and the whole framing plot with Christopher Sly, that there's that induction to the play, and it's like a play within a play, and the framing plot has this drunken commoner who is deluded or tricked into thinking that he's a nobleman.
Yes.
And so scholars have gone back and looked at the original version, what seems to be the original version of the Shrew play, and which was written far too early to have been written by Shakespeare of Stratford, but it ties together with the later version we see published in the First Folio, and it's one of a number of indications linking that play to Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford. So I don't know if we have time to go through. I mean, the case for Oxford is powerful, And there are really fundamental reasons to doubt the case for Stratford. We've mentioned a few of those. He never traveled outside England. There's no opportunity realistically for him to really gain the perspectives and the knowledge that would be required. How did he have access to untranslated works of Greek literature? How did he learn French and Italian? Even if he went to the Stratford Grammar School, which is totally undocumented, at most he would have gotten a rudimentary Latin grammar education. It doesn't really account for everything in the plays. The other key point is even Stratfordian scholars, Sir Stanley Wells, the most distinguished Shakespeare expert in the world, probably a staunch Stratfordian, he has admitted that during the life of William Shakespeare of Stratford, there is no evidence clearly linking him personally to the works of Shakespeare. All of the evidence is posthumous, the first folio of 1623, and that was 7 years after he died. When Shakespeare of Stratford dies in 1616, deafening silence. No memorials, no tributes, no eulogies. Nobody seems to notice that England's greatest writer has died. More than 7 years later, we have the folio, and the folio is filled with a lot of ambiguous, puzzling double entendres that raise still more questions. So contrary to the conventional wisdom, there are a lot of indications of doubt. In fact, people were publishing expressions and indications of doubt, suggestions that the author's name might be a pseudonym as early as the 1590s. So more than 30 years before the Stratfordian theory is really debuted in the posthumous first folio, we actually have doubts and hints about authorship during the lifetime of the author. And that's not widely enough known, but it should be studied more carefully.
So the mystery has been a mystery for the lifetime of having public access to the works.
This has been going on for 425 years. Elizabethans and Jacobeans themselves had lots of questions and doubts about the authorship. Some people obviously knew. It may have been a polite fiction. Perhaps the truth was well known to some, suspected by others, and maybe a matter of indifference to most people. I mean,
Sure.
A lot of common people, they may not have cared. Why should they care? Back in those days, Elizabethan England was a police state with torture, arbitrary arrest, the death penalty. You could get beheaded for asking questions. There was no free press. Most people were illiterate. People didn't have the opportunity to explore authorship. Only since the 1800s, the Victorian era, up to our own modern day, only now do we really have the resources to go back and explore and try to piece together the fragmentary evidence. And when we do that, we're discovering a lot of questions
And that
about
is
the
something
Stratfordian theory.
that is something that this podcast series is dedicated to helping achieve and in letting you know about the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship and its mission to continue researching this issue and getting to the truth of the Shakespeare authorship mystery right here with you through Don't Quill the Messenger. We're about out of time today. Like to give Bryan an opportunity to say a few closing remarks. The thing about us running a little over time today is you can tell that there is so much to learn and there is so much
to say. Yeah.
so much to get into, and we've just barely scratched on the surface today, but I think in a wonderful way that gives people some context as to where to look. What intrigued you about this man today that made you think, I'd like to look more into that. I'd like to look more into him actually going to Italy. I'd like to look more into his relationship with his wife. I really need to read that poem now and see what they're talking about, how it connects to this guy.
Yeah, what a lot of us find out, and this has been tremendous fun, Stephen, so it's been great to, like you say, we've just barely scratched the surface. But what I would say is that Oxford, we don't think we have all the answers. We don't think we've figured out the complete truth. We want to see this researched and studied and debated. And we say, bring on the critics, bring on the scrutiny. There's a lot of questions still unresolved here. So we welcome debate and further study. We just find it sad that many Orthodox Stratfordians kind of want to shut down the debate and say, don't ask questions, move along, folks, no issue here. So we'd say, come to our website, Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. And what we have found, what I found as an Oxfordian, is when you start exploring the life of Oxford, his experiences, and the whole history, it just opens up a whole nother dimension. The plays and poems no longer are just two-dimensional things on a page. They become three-dimensional, much more vivid, and you just become much more interested in them. and you see a much richer background and perspective. And certainly I know for people like you, Stephen, I mean, you're a director, an actor, and a performer of Shakespeare, and that's another crucial dimension as well. So I say, let's explore this question further. And it is tremendous fun. Like you say, we've barely scratched the surface.
Well, Bryan, we'll have to have you back for a future episode, and we'll switch seats. You can sit here in my chair and I'll sit there, and we can talk about what it's like to know Oxford and his connection to the plays while actually artistically producing the plays.
I would love to hear about that.
And directing the actors, about where you believe as an Oxfordian director the impetus for these characters and their emotions is coming from. So that would be a great future.
That'd be a great episode to do, yeah.
Well, thank you again, Bryan, for coming to talk to us about Oxford 101 and teaching us a little bit about this man, Edward de Vere. That's why we are here, ladies and gentlemen. Vero nihil verius, nothing more true than truth, remember, is the Oxford family motto. And that is the purpose of Don't Quill the Messenger, revealing the truth about Shakespeare authorship. For more information, you can visit the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website at shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org. That's shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org. You'll find all kinds of sources and resources to answer your questions about the Shakespeare authorship mystery. Once again, thanks for being here. Keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.